It's estimated that the value of all the resources locked up in asteroids floating between Mars and Jupiter is in the sextillions of dollars. And with the mention of that naughty little number, I'm going to take a bit of a detour to let you know what I've been up against trying to make this script PG-13. In the end, I decided to just get all this out of the way up front. For one thing, news agencies fall all over themselves to make jokes anytime a company shows off a new launch system. And the competition between a few industry leaders has been cast as a rocket measuring contest for billionaire bragging rights. But you can't just blame the media, because while Jeff Bezos picked the relatively innocent name of Blue Origin for his company, Richard Branson went with Virgin Galactic. And Elon Musk, well, I get that SpaceX stands for Space Exploration Technologies, but you can't argue with how it sounds. And lest you think that that seductive little twist of phonics is an accident, I'd like to point out the name of every production vehicle made by Musk's other company, Tesla. Here they are, in order. And maybe I shouldn't have been so surprised that I found myself drowning in innuendo when I first started to research this topic. I mean, NASA sent porn to the moon way back in 1969, and in 2004 they used a rover to draw a on Mars. In a way, it's comforting to know that even at our very best, humans are gonna human. And with that out of the way, let's drill into a now slightly uncomfortable exploration of what it would take to start our very own mining company in space. Besides being roughly the amount of money you might pay to never hear me make a joke again, that $1 sextillion that's floating around in the asteroid belt is written as a 1 followed by 21 zeros, or this number here. This is an unfathomably large number that dwarfs other unfathomably large numbers. It's actually several hundred times more dollars than there are grains of sand on Earth, which is why it's not overstating the point to say that the commercialization of space could be the next gold rush and industrial revolution all rolled into one. The last time we had one of those, Andrew Carnegie became the richest man in modern history by selling steel to the United States while it was in the throes of frantic industrialization. Whoever figures out how to supply this new industrial revolution could well be the next Carnegie, the steel baron of space. A couple of weeks ago, people left Earth for the first time in a privately owned spacecraft. And orbital tourism, private space stations, refueling depots, moon bases, all of these things are well past the planning stages right now. But today, we're not going to concern ourselves with hauling other people's satellites into orbit or selling glorified plane tickets. We are going to set our sights much, much higher, because there's gold in them there space potatoes, and we're going to go get it. If we're going to start our own space empire, we're going to need spaceships, and we're going to need a company, and that company's going to need a name. So what should we call this thing? The name Lapis Aspera won my household poll, but I've probably made enough dong jokes for a movie I'm filing under education, and I promised to pick a name provided by a viewer. So we're going to go with Kuiper Consolidated. Our company has but one goal: to make money mining resources in space. As you can see, our goal actually has two parts to it: go get stuff and sell that stuff for more than it costs us to go get it. To get that stuff, we do actually need to get into space. And Kuiper Consolidated can do that in one of two ways. We can build everything ourselves, rockets, engines, launch pads, all of it, or we can rely on other companies to get us into the black. As for the sell stuff part, there are two general markets we could serve. We can sell fuel and building materials for use off of Earth to supply the burgeoning space industry, or we can bring precious metals and other spacey stuff back here to sell on Earth. Here at Kuiper Consolidated, we're going to focus on that second goal, selling stuff here back on Earth. But first, we should scope out the competition. So let's take a look at the companies currently battling for control of this new market. Private industry's involvement in space didn't happen overnight. In 2010, President Obama proposed shifting the responsibility from federal agencies to commercial companies for U.S. missions into low Earth orbit. The idea was to provide financial incentives for private industry to create the framework of a new commercial sector. By 2018, commercial spaceflight activity accounted for almost 80% of the roughly $415 billion spent on stuff humans are doing off our little planet. Now, in the US alone, there are more than 24 companies building rocket engines and satellites, or capable of putting anything from a toaster to a car into low Earth orbit. Prices start at around $500,000 for the toaster side of things. The biggest players are SpaceX, of course, Blue Origin, founded by Amazon's Jeff Bezos, a Lockheed-Boeing joint venture called United Launch Alliance, and Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic, none of whom are planning to do any asteroid mining in the foreseeable future. As far as companies who might be direct competition for Kuiper Consolidated, there kind of aren't any. At least, not anymore. In 2012, Arkid Astronautics became Planetary Resources, a company formed with the express purpose of mining asteroids. It went super well, and they all got really rich. Yeah, I'm just kidding. Despite about $100 million of investment, Planetary Resources went broke. They got bought out, they had all their intellectual property made public, and all of their hardware was auctioned off in just the last couple months. Planetary Resources might actually be a cautionary tale for our little company. They were well funded, and they were led by some pretty smart folks. So what happened? Well, they did have a string of bad luck, including an incident where this rocket performed a satellite to meteorite conversion and spread all their hardware over the countryside. But mostly, their problem was timing. There was a huge explosion of interest in commercial spaceflight in the early 2010s, but the technology wasn't quite there. Practical hardware hadn't caught up with the dream. The same thing happened with the dot-com boom in the 1990s, which spawned hundreds of companies, almost none of which still exist. Sometimes it's not so great to go first. You can read about thousands of these failures on your favorite search engine. Not that one. No, not that one. Really? Nope. 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 Damn. A lot of these early companies had great ideas and no idea how to accomplish them. Never mind make them profitable. And just as more reasonable, lucky, better run, or better funded companies survived the bubble of the early internet, the same thing has happened in the space industry over the last 10 years. Companies that successfully adapted an existing industry for space, or that outperformed in the existing space market, have solved some of the unforeseen problems which killed those projects that were overly ambitious for the times. The advancements these companies have made take the idea of mining in space from completely unrealistic to just very, very hard and expensive. But it's nice to know that Kuiper Consolidated isn't some collective delusion. This is actually possible, but we should probably start adding up how much money it will take to turn it into a reality. The main areas of commercial space activity right now fall into these three groups. Space infrastructure, get stuff off Earth to service what's already in orbit. Satellites, get stuff off Earth to put it into orbit. And tourism, get people off Earth who will pay stupid amounts of money for the view. There's a theme here. Get stuff off Earth. Turns out dealing with our dirty old planet's gravity is the single most difficult hurdle facing anyone who wants to do anything in space. Getting away from Earth's gravity is like the physics version of an entire toxic relationship. It's the same either way. From wherever you start, you're going to pour energy into it until you can get far enough away that it stops coming after you. And the stronger the attraction, the more expensive it's going to be to counteract. As far as science is concerned, this is the equation that lets you figure out how fast you have to be going to get away from Earth's gravity. For our purposes, we'll obviously need to hire a whole team of folks who understand how to put this equation into action. But the business version of this equation is expressed a little differently. Dollars per kilogram put into orbit. This equation takes the entire cost of materials, labor, bribes, everything we spent on building and launching our rocket, and divides it by how much cargo that rocket can get into space. For example, to get 3 dudes and their gear to the moon, the US built the Saturn V rocket, which accelerated those guys up to 11 kilometers a second. When it was launched in 1969, the first stage of that rocket alone accounted for more than 2% of all the energy being used in the US during its flight. As you can imagine, this is kind of expensive. Those Saturn V rockets were one-shot deals, cost more than $1 billion per launch, and nothing was reused. The Space Shuttle changed that. But even then, in 1980, it cost the equivalent of $85,000 per kilogram to launch something into orbit. But because at least the shuttle part of the shuttle could be reused, the cost came down a little with each successive launch, as the development cost of the program was spread out over the lifespan of the system. By 1995, the Space Shuttle had that cost down to a tiny little $26,000 a kilogram. But the initial cost of developing a reusable system can itself be pretty daunting. The USSR tried to make its own space shuttle. It was called the Buran. It cost the equivalent of $49 billion to develop, flew once, and then the Soviet Union's economy collapsed. To be fair, their shuttle program wasn't the only reason the Soviet economy fell apart, but it didn't help. And going bankrupt is one of several things I'd rather not have in common with the USSR. But we're in luck. Right now, SpaceX can put something into orbit for a minuscule $1,300 per kilogram, at least for their own stuff. If we want them to launch our stuff, it'll be more like $3,000 a kilogram. Which brings us to our first executive decision. Do we build our own rockets or take the world's most expensive rideshare into space? To figure out the economics of this decision, we can look at existing companies. According to NASA, SpaceX spent about $400 million to develop their current Falcon 9 rocket. But they've also had operation costs for being in business for almost 2 decades. They developed the Dragon capsule, the Raptor engine, and a few other things along the way. It's not easy to get exact numbers, but it seems like they've gone through about $1 billion to $1.5 billion since Mr. Musk put in his first $100 million investment in May of 2002. But it's always more expensive to be first. So, let's say we hire a bunch of experienced SpaceX folks and avoid most of the mistakes SpaceX made as the pioneer in the field. In that case, about $1 billion seems like a pretty fair estimate. This would cover securing a launch facility, paying for FAA licenses, hiring a workforce, and the amount of money it would cost to develop a launch system. Now we can compare the $1 billion it would cost to develop our own system with the cost per launch it would take to launch with something like SpaceX. After a certain number of launches, kind of about 2 dozen actually, it becomes cheaper for us just to build our own system. So to save some time in this video, from here on out, we're just going to look at the cost of developing our own rocket system to launch stuff into space. And while we're at it, if we actually want to go mining, we have to build a mining system too. If we want to send people to mine stuff in space, that adds another $55 million a seat for a ride with SpaceX, or a bucket load more money to develop our own crew system. So we're going to stick to robots. But we do have to pay for the development of these robots. To give us some kind of benchmark for the cost here, we can use the Hayabusa 2 mission launched by JAXA in 2014 for about $175 million in today's money. This little half-ton satellite went off to an asteroid called Ryugu, blew a crater into it with what was basically the business end of an anti-tank missile, collected some debris, and is bringing it back to Earth as we speak. It should be here in the next couple of months, with a few kilograms of fresh asteroid bits. I also found a great paper on the economics of asteroid mining that I'll link in the description. We're going to assume around $300 million to design and build both the mining craft and their production facility. We're going to want to be making a lot of these after all. We're going to say that our miners will actually split into 2 systems once they're at the asteroid, one to mine and one to come back with the goods once it's full. As for the cost of each of these mining units, we can again look at SpaceX. Right now, SpaceX is building its Starlink internet service. Basically, they're trying to bring high-speed internet to anywhere on the planet by using a ridiculous amount of satellites. By ridiculous amount, I mean 12,000 to 40,000 of them. Each Starlink satellite weighs about 230 kilograms and costs about $1 million to make. So if we give our miners a commensurate markup due to the complexity and materials, we'll say that they cost about $3 million per miner. Add all that up, and we can give ourselves an estimate for how much it would cost to even get our company to the first part of our goal, that go part. We have the design and operation costs to build our own rockets, we have the production costs, we just now need to figure out how much it will cost us each time we chuck a handful of these things at an asteroid. If each one of our little robots costs $3 million and weighs half a ton, that means we can launch about 10 of them at a time if we're using a Falcon 9 or equivalent. If they cost $3 million a piece, that means $30 million to build 10 miners and around $30 million to toss them into space on a rocket. If you're like the critical voice in my head and just remembered that earlier I said the Falcon 9 could carry 23 tons into orbit, you're probably wondering why we can only launch 10 miners at a time. Well, I did say that, but I also said it takes more energy the further you want to go from Earth. That 23 tons is what a Falcon 9 can put into low Earth orbit. We want to get out of Earth's gravity completely. So we have to reduce our payload to around 5.5 tons in order to have the energy to leave Earth's gravity completely behind. Because the closest thing we'd want to mine is the moon, but out past Mars is where things get crazy. So far, we've spent around $1.5 billion getting our company ready to go space mining. And it'll cost another $60 million anytime we send our miners on their way. So how on earth can this possibly be profitable? Well, it's kind of a good news, bad news situation. Bad news is that every company that's tried this so far has gone bankrupt. However, it'll only take about 1 metric ton of gold to pay for each launch. But that gold is 300 million miles away. The good news is, there's a lot of it. Like, a lot of, just let me show you. This is 16 Psyche. It's an asteroid located right here in our solar system. It's 110 miles in diameter and primarily made of nickel and iron. But it also has a lot of gold. Gold, you say? How much gold? Well, we're not exactly sure, but a safe estimate is somewhere between a bunch of it and all of it, because experts place the value of 16 Psyche at around $700 quintillion, or as I like to say, 0.7 sextillion, all on its own. For scale, the total yearly GDP of Earth, like all of it, is around $78 trillion. So, okay, pretend I'm the Earth, and all the money I have in the world is $1. Compared to that, 16 Psyche is a millionaire more than 9 times over. And this is where we begin to truly understand the word astronomical as an adjective. Because the scale of our solar system makes everything humanity has accomplished so far seem like Tinker Toys next to the Burj Khalifa. This enormous scale is where all this kind of begins to fall apart. Because even though this one asteroid is worth the equivalent of infinite money, that only matters if you can get someone to pay you enough to make it worth the trip. NASA has a mission out to this particular asteroid, planned to launch in 2022, but it won't arrive until 2026. That's 4 years of travel time, one way. Granted, there are closer asteroids that have a similar makeup, and there's the moon, but I think it's time we check in with our numbers because we've come far enough along to have a decent idea of what this is going to cost. Kuiper Consolidated is going to mine at a closer asteroid than 16 Psyche, so we're figuring on a year of travel time each way. We're also going to assume it takes our miners about a year to gather enough gold to fill up that part that comes back to Earth. So, the entire system takes a year to get there, it takes a year to mine the materials, and then that return piece comes back to Earth over the course of a year while the miner stays in place. When we launch more stuff, our rocket can hang out in orbit and pick up some of those cargo pods that have come back before it returns to Earth. So let's add all this up. To develop and legally launch our own reusable system, we figure about $1 billion. To develop our mining ships and their factory, another $300 million. To produce each mining ship individually, $3 million. To launch 10 of them to escape velocity, $60 million. And cost to operate our own company every year, figuring on a reasonable staff, $40 million for salary and building upkeep. We're going to be wildly optimistic and assume that our little cargo pods can come back with about 400 kilograms of gold. That might sound like it would take up a ton of space, but gold is extremely dense. 1 cubic foot of the stuff actually weighs about 550 kilograms. So the limiting factor here is not cargo space, but actually how much weight our rocket can safely bring back to Earth. Again, we're being crazy optimistic and assuming we can land with only a slightly smaller cargo weight than we launched with. Say everything works out great. With the current price of gold, we're coming back with about $224 million of gold per launch. Not bad, right? Well, when we factor in what we spent to build the miners and launch them into orbit, we're down to $154 million in profit per launch. If we can manage 2 launches a year, we'll start to collect about $268 million in profit every year. But because it takes a year to get to the asteroid, a year to mine, and a year to come back, we won't make any money at all until 3 years after our first launch. And we'll have spent about $1.5 billion before we can sell our first nugget of space gold, which means we'll become profitable sometime in our 8th year of operation, or around our 17th launch. So, space mining is absolutely possible, probably profitable, and undoubtedly awesome. But spending $1.5 billion in startup costs to break even in nearly a decade is a tough ask. I'm obviously making a lot of assumptions here, but I think you'll see that in the end it doesn't really matter. Sure, more launches a year would make us profitable more quickly, and launches that just take up gold pods would be cheaper than launching full mining systems. But even if we were recovering 10 launches a year, we'd only be doing about the same revenue as the Cheesecake Factory. Granted, with a better profit margin. Again, that's assuming that my estimated costs are at all accurate, that our miner bots work as intended, and that nothing blows up on launch or borks a re-entry to drop half-ton nuggets of molten gold onto downtown Miami at 4,000 miles an hour. The point is that while it does seem possible to make money while mining shiny space rocks, the barrier to entry is not worth the return on investment, while there are faster and easier ways to make money in space, which also happen to be less likely to explode. Still, it's pretty awesome to be alive at a time when mining asteroids for raw materials is something that's going to happen in the next few decades, even if the reality isn't as glamorous as lugging huge lumps of gold back to Earth. Because while gathering valuable materials from space does make sense in a few specific situations, those first space miners won't be looking for gold. They'll be looking for water. First of all, the business plan for Kuiper Consolidated doesn't make a lot of sense right now. But I have to say that harebrained schemes and business aren't always mutually exclusive. I have no idea what an energy drink that tastes like liquefied nerds has to do with jumping out of a suborbital balloon at greater than the speed of sound. But there you go. We also can't dismiss the possibility that some rich person with more money than they can spend will do this just for kicks. But unless Jeff Bezos wants to bring ice back to Earth so he can sell it to other rich people as the only water you 100% know has never ever been pee, we're going to have to wait until a mission to mine an asteroid is something you can get past a board of directors. Right now, all of our high-tech devices need a lot of specific minerals called rare earth metals, and China controls a lot of the world's known supply. A country, like the US, might elect to send back rare earth elements from space in an effort to decrease their reliance on a foreign power. The legality of this also gets a little wonky. Treaties that set international laws for space were written during the Cold War, and pretty much only focused on, please don't put nukes in space, and if one of you makes it to the moon, it's not yours. Which means two things: that the US can't go claiming asteroids, planets, or moons for their own, and, much to the disappointment of Bruce Willis, they can't use nukes for mining. So, if the US wanted to secure a source of rare earth materials from space, it would have to do it through a proxy private company, because companies can own stuff. Kinda. If you're wondering if Elon Musk can claim Mars for himself, or anything else about the weird reality of space law, here's a link to a companion video on the topic. The point is that anything space mining returned to Earth would only be the most valuable fraction of the materials it produced, whether that value comes from scarcity, strategic control, or from crazy rich people buying novelty items for bragging rights. For me, the more glamorous form of space mining is kind of like marriage, being an adult, or the finale of Game of Thrones. It's one of those things in life that I first experienced in my imagination as some fantasy future event that I was looking forward to. And like most things that transition from hopefully someday to right now, the reality is more difficult, less glamorous, and just kind of worse than I hoped. But honestly, that a wish became a reality at all is a triumph all its own. And after that initial shock and recalibration of expectations, there's always some unexpected perks. It's true that it's possible to start a profitable mining company in space. Is less fun than you can make enough money to buy the universe. But the version of space mining that's coming is one that directly leads to people living on Mars in the next 30 years, and also to a supply of tickets for flights around the moon. In part 2 of this series, we're going to look at the more realistic form of space mining, as well as a pretty firm when, how, and why that space mining goes hand in hand with humanity's next steps into our solar system. A couple of quick shoutouts, one to my friend Matt, who helped me with some technical issues which delayed this video by quite a bit, and one to Mr. Wentz, just for motivating these things to happen in the first place. If you haven't already and you feel like hitting that subscribe button, please do. I appreciate everybody who does, and who watches these videos in general. Thanks for watching, tell some friends, show it to others, make some comments, do the thing, and have a good day.